Your colleagues seem to like it well enough.
That's because they don't know you the way I do. They see what I let them see. Poor thing, trying so hard.
You've been drinking.
I've been celebrating. My company just secured the Meridian Tower development contract. 43 stories. $218 million. Do you understand what that means? Of course you don't.
Congratulations.
Congratulations? That's it? I just became one of the most powerful developers in this city, and you're offering me a single word like I just got promoted to manager.
The building's beautiful.
You wouldn't know beautiful if it walked up and handed you your drink. You've never had taste, never had ambition, never had anything that mattered. 8 years, Isabella. 8 years of waking up next to someone utterly unremarkable. Do you know what my friends ask me? They ask why I stay.
Why do you? Why do you?
Honestly, I ask myself the same question every morning. You were supposed to elevate me. Instead, you've been a dead weight, a liability. My CFO's wife just launched a venture capital firm. My business partner's wife sits on 2 boards.
And you?
You sit at home arranging flowers and pretending you matter? Yeah. You see? That's exactly it. You don't see anything. You can't. You're incapable of understanding the scale of what I'm building here. Tonight was supposed to be about me. Instead, I'm standing here explaining myself to someone who thought wearing that dress was a victory.
The contract says the Meridian Tower belongs to Sutton Development Group.
Exactly, my development group. Officially signed this afternoon. 500 million total valuation. We're breaking ground in 90 days.
I'd like to see the papers.
You'd like? Isabella, why would you possibly need to see anything? You wouldn't understand the first clause. You don't have the education, you don't have the mind for it, and frankly, you don't have the right to ask. This is my achievement, mine. Then I suggest you prepare yourself for an entirely different life. One without my name, without my money, without any of this. Do you understand what I'm saying?
And if I don't? If I don't, I am not negotiating this. Very clearly.
Good. Now go make yourself useful. Get me a drink, and try not to embarrass me further.
He had no idea. 3 hours earlier, Isabella had sat in a mahogany-paneled conference room on the 64th floor of the financial district and signed the final documents transferring the Meridian Tower development rights to Sutton Development Group. She owned a 42% stake in that company, a stake worth, on the current valuation, $88 million. But that wasn't the secret Daniel had just stepped on. The secret was simpler. Isabella didn't just own the building Sutton Development was about to build on. She owned the land beneath it, all 12 acres. She'd purchased the property 7 years ago through a series of shell companies and family trusts, investments Daniel had never questioned because he'd never thought to ask about them.
She was worth $340 million. Daniel was holding a glass of expensive whiskey, celebrating a contract he didn't yet understand she controlled both ends of. But to understand how Isabella ended up here and what happened when Daniel finally learned the truth, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to when she was exactly who he thought she was. Nobody at all. Isabella grew up in a quiet suburb north of the city. The only daughter of 2 accountants who'd spent their entire lives talking about the difference between assets and liabilities. Her father, Walter, had a gift for parsing numbers that others overlooked. Her mother, Catherine, had the patience to explain why those details mattered.
By the time Isabella was 16, she understood leverage in a way most MBAs never would. By 19, she'd already started making money on her own. Small real estate flips, nothing flashy, nothing her parents needed to know about. She had a quiet mind for value. She could walk into a house and see not what it was, but what it could become. More than that, she could quantify it, price it, predict the market 6 moves ahead. She went to Stanford. Not for business. She didn't need the credential. She went for economics, for the network, for the confidence that comes from sitting in the same room as people who'd grown up believing the world owed them something. That's where she met Daniel. He was in her economics elective, 3rd year, and he was the kind of handsome that makes smart women temporarily stupid. Tall, confident, with a family name that actually meant something in development circles. His father was retired. His grandfather had built some of the city's most iconic structures. Daniel was heir to that legacy, or at least that's what he told himself. What he actually was, a charming man with an instinctive understanding that he would always be compared to his grandfather, and he would always fall short. Isabella didn't fall for Daniel because he was brilliant. She fell for him because he was broken in a way she recognized, because she saw in him someone who'd been told he was important and had spent his whole life terrified that wasn't true.
She loved him. That was the first mistake. They dated for 3 years. After Stanford, Daniel went to work for a mid-tier development firm. Isabella, meanwhile, quietly built an empire of property holdings and strategic investments. She never talked about it. When Daniel asked what she did for work, she'd say something vague about consulting, and he'd nod and move on. It was easier that way, safer. Then Daniel proposed. It was romantic and clumsy and completely thoughtful in the way of someone who'd never had to think about whether they could afford the ring. She said yes because she loved him, and because some part of her, the part that had been trained by 2 accountants to see value, believed she could fix him. They married at 25. The first year was good. Isabella worked quietly. Daniel built his confidence at the development firm. He was good at what he did. Not brilliant, but competent, ambitious, good with clients. He had the gift of looking important even when he wasn't yet. By year 2, he'd been promoted to senior project manager. By year 3, he'd started his own development consultancy. Isabella let him think it was his idea. She'd simply mentioned over dinner one night that a colleague of a colleague was looking for someone to manage a smaller project. Daniel had seized on it immediately, seeing in it the first real step toward the legacy he was supposed to be building. What Isabella had actually done was engineer a series of opportunities through her network, every one positioned to look accidental, every one designed to give him exactly the kind of early wins that build a man's confidence. He started believing his own story. That's when everything changed.
By year 4 of their marriage, Daniel had 2 things: a successful consulting practice and the absolute conviction that he'd built it alone. He stopped asking what Isabella did. More than that, he stopped listening when she talked. Their conversations became monologues, him describing his clients, his deals, his vision for what Sutton Consulting would become. She learned to nod at the right moments, to ask questions that made him feel understood, to let his voice fill the space. She learned to disappear. The money became an issue around year 5. Daniel's consulting practice was doing well, but not well enough. He wanted more. He wanted the kind of scale that required capital, tens of millions, not thousands. He wanted to develop his own projects, not just advise on theirs. Isabella had offered to help. She could have shown him her investments, introduced him to her network, given him access to the capital he was desperate for. She should have. Instead, she watched him slowly realize that he couldn't do it alone, and watched him decide that meant she was holding him back. "You're a burden," he said one night, not even looking at her, just sorting through the mail. "You're safe and you're comfortable, and you've never wanted more. That's fine for you, but it's not fine for me anymore. You're keeping me small." She didn't argue. She never did.
Year 6 is when the public humiliation started. It began small, a comment at a dinner party about her clothes, a dismissal of her opinion in front of his colleagues, an exchange with one of his business partners where he laughed, actually laughed at something she'd said, shook his head at his partner, and said she doesn't understand what real business looks like. But it escalated. He began introducing her to people as, "My wife Isabella, she stays home mostly." The implication was clear. She was ornamental, unnecessary, a mistake he was making but hadn't quite fixed yet. He started spending more time away, business dinners that ran until midnight, conferences in other cities, weekends at the office. When he came home, he'd tell her about the people he'd met, the deals he was structuring, the way his reputation was growing. always positioning her as someone on the outside, someone who couldn't possibly understand. He began suggesting, with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety, that he might be happier with someone else, someone more ambitious, someone who challenged him, someone who was building their own empire instead of just existing within his. Isabella listened to all of it and said nothing. What she did was plan. Year 7, Daniel finally made the leap. He left the consultancy and started Sudden Development Group. He was going to build actual projects now, not just consult on them. This was his moment, his legacy. He told Isabella he needed capital, $2 million to start, an initial fund to position the company, to get the office space, to retain the right people. Isabella gave it to him. Not from her own accounts, she was too careful for that, too aware that money leaves traces. Instead, she had her attorneys create a loan through a third-party fund, with terms that would eventually transfer ownership to Daniel if he could meet the payments. He couldn't, of course, but that wasn't the point.
The point was that he believed he was building something. The point was that she had given him exactly what he needed to believe in himself, and then watched him stop believing in her. The humiliation of year 7 was different. It wasn't public, it was private. It was him looking at her across the dinner table one night and saying with complete sincerity, "I think we should see other people. You've been a good wife, Isabella, but you've also been a ceiling. I need to find someone who inspires me." She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply placed her napkin on the table and said, "Okay." What shocked him, what he couldn't quite process, was that she didn't beg. She didn't fight. She didn't threaten to leave or take half of what he had. She simply accepted it, the same way she'd accepted everything else, which only deepened his contempt, because to Daniel, acceptance looked like proof that she'd never cared at all. While Daniel was building Sutton Development Group with Isabella's seed money and Isabella's carefully orchestrated connections, Isabella was building something else entirely. She couldn't have done it from her own accounts. Too obvious, too easy for Daniel's lawyers to discover, eventually, if things ever got to that point. Instead, she built it through the kind of financial architecture that only someone with a serious understanding of tax law and asset protection could construct.
3 shell companies in Delaware, 2 trusts set up in her maiden name through a family friend's law firm, an investment fund nominally owned by her mother but actually managed by Isabella through a power of attorney she'd had the foresight to establish years earlier. To the outside world, Isabella was a housewife with her mother's inheritance quietly working for her in the market. The reality was far more complex. In year 6, when Daniel was most actively humiliating her, Isabella had identified 12 city blocks in the developing section of the waterfront. The property was owned by an aging commercial developer who'd been trying to liquidate for 5 years. The land was underdeveloped, the buildings aging, the neighborhood transitional. Nobody important was looking at it yet. Isabella was. She'd commissioned a private urban planning analysis. She'd studied the city's development roadmap, identified the infrastructure projects that were moving forward, traced the likely path of gentrification. She'd done the kind of deep analysis that takes a certain kind of person to even conceive of. Then she bought 12 acres, piece by piece, through proxies and shell companies over the course of 18 months. The total investment, $41 million. It was the biggest risk she'd ever taken. It was also, she knew with the kind of certainty that comes from truly understanding numbers, going to be the most profitable.
By year 7, when she was watching Daniel negotiate his first small contracts for Sutton Development, the waterfront property had already begun to appreciate. The city had quietly announced a major infrastructure project for the area. The light rail was coming through, a new water reclamation facility, city investment in public spaces. The land she'd bought for $400,000 per acre was now worth $600,000 and climbing. She didn't tell Daniel. She never intended to. Instead, she let him believe that his success was his own achievement. She watched him close smaller deals, watched him gain confidence with each one. She watched him build Sudden Development from nothing into something legitimate. She was proud of him, genuinely proud, even as he was actively dismantling the possibility that she mattered. That was the cruelest irony. She loved him still. She believed in him. She was actively, deliberately, making him more successful than he could have ever been on his own, and he couldn't see her doing it, because he'd stopped looking at her entirely. By year 8, Daniel was moving fast. He'd closed 3 significant projects. His reputation was growing. He was becoming known in development circles as someone to watch, someone with an instinct for identifying emergent neighborhoods and closing deals before the market caught up. What he didn't know was that Isabella had introduced every single opportunity to him through carefully maintained intermediaries. The contacts, the deals, the financing, all of it had come through her network, positioned to look coincidental. She was the invisible architect of his rise. And then, in the second month of year 8, Sutton Development was approached about the Meridian Tower project. The developer who'd owned the land came to Daniel directly because Isabella's attorneys had made sure to recommend him personally to the seller. The contract was worth $218 million. It would be Daniel's biggest deal by far. It would make him genuinely important, not just in local development circles, but in the broader commercial real estate world. It would be the thing that finally proved to him what he'd always suspected, that he was worth something. What Daniel didn't know was that the land beneath the tower was already owned, not by him, not by Sutton Development, but by a trust that Isabella's attorneys had quietly assembled over the previous 6 months. Isabella didn't own the building yet, but she owned the land, and in real estate, the land is everything. She had simply been waiting for him to want it.
Daniel was insufferable during the weeks leading up to the gala. He talked about the Meridian Tower constantly. He'd researched every detail of the structure, every permitting requirement, every potential complication. He'd spoken with contractors and engineers and city officials. He'd positioned himself as the architect of this vision, the only person who could see what this project needed to be. Isabella watched it all with a kind of clinical detachment. She knew, because she'd studied the site blueprints for months, that the project was technically sound and would be enormously profitable. She also knew that the profit margins Daniel was anticipating were based on land acquisition costs that would be negotiated downward once the Meridian Tower development was publicly announced. Because the owner of the land, Isabella's Shell Trust, was about to become a critical negotiating party. "You should come to the gala tonight," Daniel said the morning of the event. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. "I want my wife there when I announce the deal. I want people to see me as someone who's built something that matters. You can stand there and look, well, as good as you're capable of looking. Don't embarrass me." Isabella had already selected a dress. Something simple, elegant, expensive in a way that only another wealthy person would recognize. Something that whispered money rather than shouted it. "I wouldn't dream of it," she said. The gala was held at the Paramount Hotel, in a ballroom that overlooked the city skyline. Daniel was glowing. He'd already had several drinks, already positioned himself as the center of a small constellation of business people and journalists. He was telling the story of the Meridian Tower, the way he'd identified the opportunity, the way he'd structured the deal, the way he was going to transform the entire waterfront district. Nobody was listening as carefully as they should have been, except Isabella. She was standing near the champagne station, wearing her simple dress, watching her husband take credit for her work. "You're remarkably composed," a voice said behind her. Isabella turned. It was Victoria Chen, one of the city's most prominent commercial real estate attorneys, and, as it happened, the registered agent for 3 of Isabella's shell companies. "I'm always composed," Isabella said.
"I imagine you are." Victoria smiled slightly. "You know this deal is about to become far more complicated than he understands." "I'm counting on it." "The Land Trust's attorney reached out to me this morning. They'll be sending him a letter tomorrow. It seems his development will require acquisition of a parcel he doesn't yet own, and that parcel has a very specific owner with very specific terms." Isabella sipped her champagne. "How specific?" "Specific enough that he'll need to renegotiate his entire project structure. The profit margins he's anticipating will be cut by approximately 37%. The timeline will shift. The stakeholder structure will change. He'll need, essentially, to go back to the drawing board on a project he's already publicly committed to." "What does the owner want?" "That," Victoria said, "is the interesting part. The owner wants to remain anonymous for now, but they want a meeting. They want to see how badly Sutton Development needs this deal, and then I suspect they want to show him exactly who they are." Isabella felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph. She'd known this moment was coming, had orchestrated it. But something else. Something like grief, maybe. The final moment before he became someone different to her. Before the version of Daniel that believed in her died completely.
The letter arrived at Daniel's office at 8:47 a.m. the next day. Isabella watched his face through the glass partition of his office as his assistant delivered it. She watched him tear it open, read the first paragraph, go absolutely still. He was pale by the second paragraph. By the third, his hands were shaking. Isabella had reviewed the letter 6 times before it was sent. Every word was technically accurate. Every sentence was legally devastating. The owner of the land parcel, a trust registered in the state of Delaware, would be willing to sell the property to Sutton Development Group. However, given the current development timeline and the public commitment Daniel had made to the Meridian Tower, the land would cost an additional $38 million above the current market valuation. The offer would be valid for 72 hours only. After that, the trust would pursue alternative development partnerships or retain the land for independent development. The letter was signed by Victoria Chen's law firm on behalf of an undisclosed client. Daniel made phone calls for 2 hours. Isabella could hear him through the thin office walls of the Sutton Development Suite, demanding information, threatening legal action, asking questions he didn't yet know he couldn't answer. By noon, he was panicked.
By 2 p.m., he was in Isabella's home office, sitting in the chair across from her desk, asking her if she knew anything about land trusts, about property development complications, about what happened when a developer overcommitted to a project and then discovered they didn't actually have access to the core asset. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. He poured out the entire situation. The Meridian Tower, the timeline, the public commitments, the fact that his entire business model for the next 5 years was suddenly contingent on acquiring a piece of land he couldn't find the owner of. "I'm ruined," he said. "If I can't close this project, if I have to publicly announce that I overstepped..."
"That's not possible," Daniel said. "You don't have that kind of money. You don't have access to that kind of capital. I've been managing a personal investment portfolio since I was 19 years old," Isabella said. "I've been building property acquisitions through family trust since I was 22. When we married, my net worth was approximately $85 million. Today, it's $342 million. Daniel was staring at her as though she were someone he'd never seen before. "The Meridian Tower deal," Isabella continued, "the opportunities you've been given, the connections you've leveraged, I created all of them. I built your reputation. I guided every significant decision Sutton Development has made since its inception. You thought you were self-made because I was careful enough to let you think that. I loved you enough to give you the gift of believing you mattered." "This is insane," Daniel whispered. "This is a lie." "It's not." Isabella placed the folder on the desk between them. "These are certified documents. You can have your attorneys review them. The land is mine. The ownership is legal and irrevocable, and I'm willing to sell it to Sutton Development for $65 million. $65 million? That's $27 million less than market valuation. That's me giving you 37% profit margin buffer that you were expecting, even though you were planning to humiliate me at a company gala yesterday. I'm giving you this because some part of me still loves you, even though you haven't loved me in at least 3 years, even though you made it clear last week that you were planning to leave me for someone more suitable." Daniel's face had gone from panic to rage to something darker, a kind of existential dread.
"You set this up," he said finally. "You trapped me." "I freed you," Isabella said quietly. "I made you successful. I gave you opportunities and connections and capital and guidance, all wrapped in the gift of believing you'd earned it yourself. And then, when you'd become too arrogant, which means I can't build anything without you." "No, but you can build something with me." Daniel stood up. "I'm not selling my company to you. I don't want your company. I want you to understand something. I have never asked for credit for anything I've built. I've never demanded recognition for the investments I've made. In you, in your career, in your success. I've been invisible, and I've been fine with that. But I'm not going to keep loving someone who's contemptuous of me, while simultaneously unwilling to acknowledge that he would be nothing without my capital, my intelligence, and my patience. So what is it you want? Isabella sat back in her chair. I want you to read every document in this folder. I want you to have your attorneys review them. And then I want you to come back to me with an offer for the land, a fair offer between partners.
Daniel read the documents that night. He had his attorneys read them the next morning. By evening, he'd confirmed that Isabella had quite literally been building an empire while he had been building a career. He didn't sleep. The next morning, he walked into her office. He looked destroyed, hollowed out in the way of someone who'd had his entire internal narrative dismantled. "I'm sorry," he said. Isabella didn't respond. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I'm sorry for every dismissive thing I said. I'm sorry for not seeing what you were building. I'm sorry for the way I treated you." "That's not what matters," Isabella said. "What matters is what happens next." "What do you want to happen?" "I want you to build the Meridian Tower. I want you to do it as a genuine partnership. I'll sell you the land at $65 million. In exchange, you'll give me operational oversight on the project and 20% equity in the development when it concludes. You'll publicly acknowledge to your investors, to the press, to your colleagues, that this project is a joint venture between Sutton Development and me. You'll introduce me to your business network, not as an ornament, but as a partner."
And if I refuse? Then I keep the land, and you spend the next 5 years in litigation trying to acquire it at full market price. And you spend those same 5 years explaining to every developer in this city why your first major project collapsed. Daniel nodded slowly. "We should probably talk about the marriage thing, too." "Yes," Isabella agreed. "We probably should." They did. It took 3 months and a marriage counselor before they arrived at something resembling honesty. They loved each other, but they didn't like each other. They'd built something together, but they'd built it on a foundation of secrecy and contempt. Daniel had needed to believe he was self-made. Isabella had needed to believe he was worth saving. Neither of those things was true, and once they both acknowledged it, the marriage became untenable. They divorced amicably. Daniel kept Sutton Development. Isabella took the land assets. The Meridian Tower was built as a joint venture, with both their names on the development, both their visions in the architecture. It was beautiful. Everyone said so. It was completed 3 years later, on budget and ahead of schedule. It won several architectural awards. It became the symbol of waterfront renewal the city had been hoping for. On opening day, Daniel shook Isabella's hand in front of a crowd of investors and journalists and city officials. He said the words they'd agreed on. "I couldn't have built this without her." She smiled and said, "Neither of us could have built this without the other." It wasn't quite the truth, but it was close enough. Isabella spent the years building her empire further, not in secrecy anymore, but quietly, methodically, with the kind of focus that comes from finally allowing yourself to be ambitious. She developed properties across 3 cities. She sat on the boards of 3 investment funds. She became known in the real estate world as someone with an almost supernatural ability to identify where the market was going.
Daniel built Sutton Development into a major player in commercial real estate. He became known for ethical practices and community-focused development. He gave talks about partnership and vulnerability. He remarried to someone who saw him, actually saw him for who he was rather than who he pretended to be. They didn't become close friends, but they became something else. Colleagues, partners in business, if not in life. People who'd loved each other badly and learned, eventually, to work with each other well. Isabella, on quiet mornings in her office overlooking the city she'd quietly built, would sometimes think about that gala, about the moment when she'd let him humiliate her one final time before showing him the truth. She'd made the choice to stay invisible for 7 years. She'd made the choice to love someone who didn't deserve it. She'd made the choice to believe that if she was smart enough, patient enough, and strategic enough, she could make him worthy of her faith. What she'd learned was simpler. Some people don't need to be saved. Some people need to be destroyed, completely and utterly, so they can rebuild themselves from scratch. Daniel had been one of those people, and Isabella, in the end, had loved him enough to do it.
So tell me, did she do the right thing? Was the reveal justified, or was it simply cruelty wrapped in the language of love? Comment below. I want to hear what you think. And if you're looking for more stories about the people who were underestimated and undervalued until the moment they became impossible to ignore, hit subscribe. New stories every week. Stories of quiet power, delayed justice, and the people who learned to use their silence as a weapon. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait and watch and let them dig the hole deep enough that they'll never get out. See you next week.